The transition to the next speaker is easy because I am the next speaker. So let me just say that I think my talk is inspired by many of the questions that Lisa has already discussed, but maybe I'm taking a little bit narrower focus, and this comes also from what I find a fascinating conflict in the whole response to the COVID-19 is the conflict between the save lives approach and the protect systems approach, and I'll explain a little bit what I mean by that. So as the COVID-19 pandemic approached, the Icelandic Minister of Health woke up to a strange reality, exploring with her fellow ministers what kind of permissions the Icelandic government had, according to the law, in case Icelandic society was endangered by an epidemic. She realized that the permissions to act became severely limited once public health authorities had determined that the danger was real. First of all, her power to issue binding orders of government were limited to what the chief infectiologist or epidemiologist would previously recommend. Moreover, if the chief infectiologist judged it necessary because of time constraints or the seriousness of the situation, he or she could issue binding orders about necessary action to prevent or reduce infections. So she may have wondered, isn't it a strange emergency situation where the power of the minister is in a way reduced and another official, a non-political, temporarily is granted the real executive power? In fact, there are few situations that affect a clear transfer of power from one governmental body to another, from ministers to officials with specific roles in the daily work of public administrations, such as public health emergencies. Iceland is in no way unique in this respect, although the laws are different from country to country, of course. But we must also keep in mind that the letter of the law often conceals rather than reveals government practice. In a normal democratic state, we can assume that ministers are no dictators in their fields, and the power given to public health specialists is also not dictatorial. There will be consulting bodies, there will be committees, and so on, bodies that are able to minimize the danger of arbitrariness. In some cases, there might also be legal or constitutional issues at stake, so that those in charge of issuing orders because of a health crisis would have to make sure that they act within the strict limits of such legal boundaries. But all that doesn't change the fact that an epidemic, not to mention a pandemic, upends everyday relations of power. In many democratic countries, people who, until an outbreak occurs, may have been little known, are suddenly in the center of decision-making. It is also slightly misleading to claim that in the case such as the one I just described, ministerial power is reduced. The combined power of the minister and the chief infectiologist is, of course, greatly increased. Together, they can order things beyond what any government can even dream of in normal times. In a recent interview, Daniel Kahneman was asked about how we should deal, each of us individually, with evaluating the information we have from different directions about the pandemic. He gave a very clear answer. Obey the specialists, the experts, the scientists. Just do as they tell you. They are much more likely than you are to get things right. And he actually told a funny story about himself, listening to himself rather than to the experts. If they tell you to stay at home, stay at home. Don't think, don't imagine that you can be smarter than they are. Kahneman's reaction mirrors the response of those who have watched in powerless horror as cheap politicians and populist demagogues have succeeded more and more to undermine the influence and authority of science. If we are not able to live with the fact that science is both fallible and the only trustworthy institution we have in evaluating such things as public health, environmental threats, the state of the climate, etc., then we are lost to the arbitrary whims of whoever manages to catch the attention of the public. So, should we not see what is unfolding now as signifying a happy return to confidence in science? Maybe science can finally become great again. Isn't that the way around the world? That around the world, the public and the politicians have called on scientists to lead us through the crisis. Isn't it bound to make most of us understand how valuable it is to be able to use science to deal with and minimize the dangers of the pandemic? And I guess as well, in those countries where this has not been done, the immense criticism that the government faces because of that would also, in the end, serve to strengthen the public view of science. Now, I guess it's clear that the story is more complicated than this. What the pandemic reveals is certainly something about executive power, but first and foremost, it reveals something perhaps about the management of power. So what governments face in the pandemic is, first of all, a situation where certain powers must be activated and limitations posed on citizens far beyond everyday restrictions. But it is essential that this is done with the cooperation of the citizens. Government decrees, independently how clear and well-founded they are, cannot simply be issued. If the public does not understand them, people will disobey them, and the amount of force necessary to enforce them will be disastrous. This is a very important part of the story. Of course, governments can rely on brute force when making sure that people stay within the confines of their houses, apartments, or whatever their housing situation is, but that's bad strategy. Even in countries with authoritarian governments, that is not so easy. In the Ebola epidemic in West Africa a few years ago, the governments in the countries hit by the crisis failed to react early enough to be able to work with the citizens to make sure that measures that were taken were understood and respected by the public in general. This also meant that when action was finally taken, it was experienced as a hostile act. People were disinclined to obey, and military force was needed to be employed to enforce necessary limitations of movement, isolation, and quarantines. Surely rules need to be enforced decisively, whether it's in China, Russia, Scandinavia, or the US. But there's a difference between emergency rules that the general public, even if grudgingly, understands, and rules that are generally not understood and seen as hostile. Therefore, it's also rather foolish to conceive of the epidemic as something governments can use to raise new stakes and ensure the increase their hold on power, as some authors have been doing lately, even comparing the situation now with the reaction to 9/11 almost 20 years ago. It's a very volatile situation, evidently, and it is a form of a natural catastrophe. It may move power from political leaders and appointees to the experts, but in that sense, it does not reduce executive power. As I have argued, it makes power more complicated. It does not make public health officials dictators. It may give additional powers to politicians who at the moment hold the executive, but at the same time also make them more vulnerable to the distrust of the public if they make mistakes or are seen as making mistakes. It puts political leadership to test. Political leaders who are unable to make the impression on citizens that they are both doing their best and, in some modest sense, in control of the situation, may lose the ability to lead. Such things are playing themselves out in front of us in several different countries. It is reasonably clear, for example, that the Russian president has been losing his authority gradually but irreversibly I would think, in the last few weeks because of the pandemic. His popularity is going down, but what is worse, surveys show declining interest in him as a major actor in Russian politics. There are others who have asserted themselves in the United States. Something similar is happening, where the absence of unified leadership opens a Pandora's box of toxic relations and waning trust in both central leadership and in many cases in local leaders, whereas others emerge as decisive and unafraid. Much depends on the way government handle the relationship to specialists. A full transfer of power to the experts is not a smart move, but neither is a confrontational attitude. The experts must be visible. That has in many countries been an almost instinctual reaction of governments. That is, to make the experts visible and let them explain the reasoning behind governmental policy, especially those who are good at it. But in the end, I think it boils down to trust. Are the governments able to do what supposedly needs to be done and do it well, but no more than that? Or are they constantly being suspected of doing more, of overstepping their authority, or simply of not being able to deal with the situation while pretending to be doing just that? In all this power trouble, there is a simple question which for the most part remains unexamined or unexplored because it touches on issues that are too difficult at this point. It has to do with the purpose of the response, the objectives that the governments are allowed and supposed to set themselves. The question is this: is the governmental response designed to save lives, or is it designed to protect essential systems of modern society? This is the important question of the current moment, and it seems that for the most part, governments are unable to give a clear answer to it. Perhaps no one really wants a clear answer to this question. They want, in some sense, to have it both ways, to be able to give at any time the answer that at that time sounds better. So first, the question of how to choose priorities is one of the fundamental questions of medical practice. The question is not whether doctors need to make decisions about the order of treatment or care, which means that there will be cases when patients do not get treatment they need in time because of other priorities, also medical, are deemed more important. It's the admissions principle. When there are fewer seats than qualified applicants, good applicants must be rejected. If a clinic or a hospital cannot deal with the cases it gets, patients who could have been saved or could have been treated so as to avoid long-term or permanent harm are not. It's therefore clearly a matter of saving lives to avoid as possible the situation where such decisions have to be made. But second, although medical practice is about saving lives, health policies are not directly about saving lives. They're about efficiency, effectiveness of the system. So when the question to be answered is what measures are necessary in a pandemic, the direct answer is not that any measure more efficient than another in saving lives is thereby the necessary measure to be taken. The correct answer is relative, depending on the kind of need and the state of the health system. On that scenario, the necessary measure is the one that does not overburden the healthcare system, but keeps it functional. In other words, the number of deaths from that perspective can be managed. The number of infections translates into number of deaths, and the necessary measure can be seen as limiting the number of infections, the number of deaths, to an amount that is still not impossible for the system. Saving as many lives as possible is not the objective. Other goals can seem more important, social goals or economic goals. It is possible in any epidemic to design governmental action with respect to minimizing infections. But in a reasonably well-equipped modern society, this means going much farther than protecting the health systems necessitates. In many of the affected countries in recent months, including Iceland, the authorities have been so efficient in dealing with the virus that hospitals have not come close to being overloaded, although obviously this is not true in many other countries. Yet the Icelandic government, just as other governments, has put emphasis on the goal of saving lives. Therefore, all information about the flattening of the curve has been delivered as joyful news corresponding to the overall wishes and hopes of a nation acting together in great solidarity. Governments have a choice between two different kinds of rhetoric or discourse. On the one hand, they can stick to the saving lives narrative, arguing that it is the moral duty of each society to protect all its citizens. Or they can abandon that narrative and pursue the goal of keeping the systems intact. Actually, they do not need to fully abandon a saving lives narrative. They just have to argue the case from the perspective of protecting the system and thereby both save lives and working for the general good of the society. What is more effective is ensuring the willingness of the people. What is more effective in ensuring the willingness of the people to cooperate? If the public is confronted with public health goals, a reason for every individual to cooperate is that this is considered necessary for the sake of society. But is that a good reason? Or is it a reason that governments can easily employ? The answer to that is perhaps, the answer to that will depend on many things. Trust in governmental institutions, available channels of communication between government and public, the epistemic infrastructure of each society, that is, can information be conveyed to the general public by explaining scientific issues, or is another kind of vocabulary necessary, maybe religious? Just as the threat of international terrorism is easy to understand, the threat of infection and death is also easy to convey and easy to understand. That's why it's tempting for any government anywhere to resort to individual dangers, leaving the public health issue aside. Instead of explaining continuously what is that for the sake of society, people should stay at home, and arguing with them that to do so is better than many other things, and that it is for public health that they should be careful. It's easier simply to say, if you go out, you take a risk of getting the disease and actually die. But the problem with this direct message is that it is not entirely true. Of course, there is increased risk, and some people are more likely to be affected badly than other people. But from an egoistic individual perspective, for most people, there is, even when a pandemic is raging, not a great risk to be infected, statistically speaking, and not a great risk that if infected, that will lead to a serious health problem or death. It is therefore unlikely that if public bodies carry the rhetoric or trying not to make the public overestimate personal risks, pointing out rather that the risk is low than illustrating possible horrors of the disease, the public will react differently. So what we see in this crisis is management of information, where it is important for the authorities to keep many balls in the air at the same time, to make sure that the public doesn't underestimate personal risks. It is so much better to have them overestimated, obviously. Emphasize the moral commitments of the society to save as many lives as possible, rather than argue more abstractly that governmental response is really about protecting the systems, and so on. Now the question is, what does the situation, the necessity of true and clear scientifically based information, yet the necessity for complex campaigning where the public must be kept sufficiently alert and also scared, what does it essentially reveal about government that we might not have known or realized before? First, I think we need to think about trust. The greater the trust in government, the more it can push the protecting systems argument rather than the saving lives argument. The cooperation with citizens for the sake of society as a whole is a healthier union than the cooperation where people accept being confined at home because they believe otherwise that they will probably die. Second, we need to think about executive power. In deliberative and epistemic democratic theory, the tendency has been to focus almost exclusively on decision-making processes, on the ways the public can enter or even take over some of the tasks of the legislature to form future policies. The crowd law movement, for instance, focuses on the fundamental texts that direct authority as what controls the flow of power. And so do obviously also questions about constitutional design. But even if the pandemic might suggest that there is something missing from the conception of power that authors such as Michel Foucault or Giorgio Agamben have made so well known, there is still something unsaid about the ways in which government exercises power. So now I seem to have lost the rest of my talk. It's almost done. My suspicion is, and I'm gonna end that in that open-ended way. So my suspicion is really that this pandemic might not change much in terms of actual power, but it will surely force us to think about a lot of things. And one of the things of that sort is the question how we might think differently about power. And that's really maybe what this in the end expresses my confusion about how to think about power that I think the situation has sort of exposed or revealed. So I'm going to stop here, and since I'm also the host, I'm going to ask Zardykhan to step in. Are you there?
So
I should say, Zhar is speaking to us from KIMEP University in Almaty.
from Kazakhstan. So I would like to talk just a little bit about how things, all these measures, policies related to public health and related to state power are revealed from the non-democratic part of the world, looking from the authoritarian region. And we could talk about former Soviet Union broadly, but we could talk about specific countries, and many of them actually reveal certain different aspects and policies. And this is a very weird thing. And when we think about the important state power, restrictive power, the unlimited authority of the government or the president of state institutions, and when you implant that in a period like this, in a pandemic, this shows certain aspects when in some ways you could see efficiency of these kind of regimes and structures, but in many other ways we would also see lots of inconsistencies, which we would be seeing here. So I would, looking from here, for region and countries and populations who are very much used to the top-down decisions, and very much there's no way to challenge, or there's no mechanism to challenge or disagree with that. When we look from Central Asia or the former Soviet Union, we could say that some countries like Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan were the first two countries which actually took very active role, and they started putting restrictions and quarantine, and actually they introduced emergency at the very early stage. While we also have some authoritarian countries like, for example, Belarus and Russia, which went into denial until quite a long period of time. And for example, we could also add here Turkmenistan and Tajikistan to some extent. They continued having public ceremonies. So authoritarianism in some cases, or the ability to more or less implant and employ lots of state power, security services and state institutions, backfired in case of Russia and Belarus, for example, when the leadership were not actually, they were pushing forward their own agendas. And in case of Uzbekistan and Kazakhstan, the weird thing is that we have two presidents in Uzbekistan and Kazakhstan, which actually came to power quite recent. So these are not the people, we just had the 1 year ago, we had the presidential switch. So we have a president who's been in power less than a year. And in Uzbekistan, we could talk a little bit longer period of time. So these are the people without great, for example, power structure under them, who are just building up their reputations. These were those who took a very, I would say, the global scientific approach. So there was no aspects of denial, and we try to follow global practices, whether Eastern or Western, and anytime when we did something, introduce quarantine, introduce emergency, introduce certain, for example, measures, health protection measures, or some job-related or some kind of transportation measures, we would always refer to some kind of world practices. While, for example, in Russia and Belarus, the whole media and the whole, starting from the presidents, of course, they were in kind of denial from the beginning, and the state TV would be saying that this is a kind of a fake thing, it's not stronger. It's more or less what, I don't know, Trump would say, this whole state apparatus would say. So this is, as you also mentioned, for those who tried to head overall the total authority, or basically the dictatorial powers, the period came out to be not very good time, because like everybody, you would be the person who would be responsible. Russia did a very weird thing. It's about this constitutional referendum. So they didn't want emergency because of the approval of the constitutional changes. So they went until the last moment without any emergency. And when we see now how Russia catches up all other countries, and basically in a few days will be the #2 countries by the people, number of infected people, while presidents like in our countries who didn't have much power, didn't have much reputation, they weirdly followed, I would say, the very practical from the perspective of the controlling the epidemic measures. So statistics also show up a country like Belarus with much smaller population than ours is much ahead, both by the death ratio and also both by the number of people infected. And this is, I would say, an important aspect, that because in our country, if the government or state would decide to do something, there's no limitations. If they would introduce emergency, it would be introduced. If they decided not to, it would not. So again, everything falls into the personalities. So if you, for example, the attitude of the president in Belarus and Russia would be different, or Turkmenistan, the whole measures would be accordingly. And if the attitude of presidents would be, I would know, at least like more or less the World Health Organization or scientific methods would be brought in, the measures would be different. So we have the two types of practices here. And one thing I also wanted to add is the influence of religion. Religious organization in Russia, for example, Russian Orthodox Church played a very active role in political propaganda and consolidating the regime. So they continued having religious ceremonies in parishes. They actually celebrated, they had Easter ceremonies just at the height of the pandemics. While, for example, in Kazakhstan or Uzbekistan, in the early March, they closed down all religious institutions. All churches, mosques, synagogues were closed down and they were forbidden. So, and we would not hear any comment from religious figures, for example, imams or priests talking about pandemics. So the whole idea of the religious institution, the propaganda, they went offline. They went just off. That nobody heard anything. They said nothing. While Russia was the case, and we still continue for a while having priests and bishops talking about the flu, it's the punishment from God, it's a fake and invented thing, and so on. And as we see now, both in Belarus and in Russia, that many, many priests got infected, many bishops died of coronavirus. So this is, for example, in people, the audience, and all these ceremonies in Russian cities, anti-coronavirus ceremonies held by priests and religious figures and other things. These are very harmful and dangerous thing, because as we talk about expert, it's scientific kind of expertise. In the meantime, when state pushes forward with non-scientific religious ways of fighting or contaminating the virus, and I think it creates a kind of a dissonance, the mental dissonance in population. So if just to sum up, looking from this region, most of the things would fall to the personality of the head of state. And depending on their attitude, we had countries which went on the total, for example, emergency situation. And we would say that, well, this is more or less the accepted scientific ways of dealing with that. In Kazakhstan, for spreading fake information about coronavirus, you could end up in prison. That people, For denial, they ended up 15 days in prison. They were arrested, some bloggers and some people from Instagram. So we actually made that only the official figures could make a speech and declaration about the virus. So the non-official people should not spread any information, which involved even arrests. While in Russia, we had even doctors saying different things, saying that it's milder than the flu, it's a fake thing, it does not exist. And later they had to change their rhetoric and they had to change all the policies, but I would say it was too late, and that's the result what we were having, for example, in Russia and Belarus. Mm-hmm. That's what I would say.
Okay, thanks. Well, if I can just briefly react to that, there might be, we have a few more minutes, so there might be some questions, I hope. I see Sævar has a question, but just before that, what I find interesting is that even when you move across the authoritarian part of the world, as you put it, you find very different situations and very different reactions. And that's one of the fascinating things about what's going on. We have examples of different reactions, which really can tell us something about how power works. And for instance, in Russia, I remember the patriarch, he took a ride around the city in a limousine carrying a sacred icon, right? So you wonder in a society, in a modern society, whether these gestures are ironic or sincere, because it seemed to be, even in a Russian context, it seemed obvious that the public at large would not have any deep emotions about religious things like that being done, but the more so in the democratic societies where there is simply it's the confusion that governments are in is something genuine. It tells us about the ways that it's simply, I mean, the word unprecedented is often used for this situation, but really it's unprecedented for these governments who are simply not able, or that don't have a clear path to managing their authority. So enough of that. Sævar.
Yes, hi, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah, I was just thinking about this question that you asked. I mean, you were wondering about whether or not politicians in a democracy could, in a time of crisis like we have now with the coronavirus, talk about efficiency and all of these things that we do in normal times. If I understood you correctly. Did I get that right?
One of the things I was saying was that there are two different arguments about why people should follow the measures that the government has ordered or made. There is the personal risk or save lives way to go, where you follow instructions because it's best for you personally. There's personal danger that you want to limit or exclude. But then there is the public health issue, and that's a much more complicated approach to convince the general public of. So my hypothesis really is that I would think the more trust you actually have in a given society, the more opportunity the government has to press the more abstract and more correct approach to say it's a public health issue, it's about the systems. The less trust you have, the more the governments will be inclined to go towards making the choices personal dangers. And I think in all the in most countries, you see some sort of a mixture of these two approaches. That's the point. So the trust issue, I think, is really pertinent there, but it's complicated how it works with the actual approach. Okay, so there's another question there. Magnus. Magnus Ingvi, are you there? Magnus seems to have disappeared.
No, he seemed to be muted, I think. He was muted.
Oh, Magnus, I see you now. No, the sound isn't working.
I think you should unmute yourself.
Well, he has.
Try speaking now, Magnus, because it says you're unmuted.
Jose, maybe you jump in. You have a question. See if Magnus will be able to. Jose.
Yes, very briefly. It's actually a question that connects with what Larry asked to Lisa, right? So in principle, we would like to believe that the people have reasons to have trust in what experts say, right? And for the two reasons that you just explained, either individualistic, selfish reasons, or public safety or public common good reasons. But then the thing is, we know, so trust, as you were just saying, trust is a very critical point, and I think, and you know, it's been a key point in all the talks so far in the conference, but it's also a very tricky one, and you know that social scientists, even if they try to make progress in understanding how it works, it's very difficult to really know how it's really working. And you know, there are many examples of people who, I mean, the anti-vaccine movement, for instance, right? People who have this kind of inclination to mistrust anything that seems to come from experts and the government and the establishment and so on and so forth. So, I would like to hear more about whether you have any particular insight about how we can promote the right kind of trust among the population.
Mm-hmm. Well, I might have something to say about what the right kind of trust is, but the question of how to promote it is a little bit trickier, as you said. Actually, I believe that in most cases, distrust is misplaced. We tend to distrust institutions where the reasons for their failures may be different from what we think. We think that, for instance, if ministries, I'm taking a very much discussed example from this country, if ministries are reluctant to give journalists information, the general tendency is to think that there are reasons for this. They don't want to give this information. But in most cases, not every case obviously, but in most cases the reasons will be different. They will be technical, they will have to do with precedents, they have to do with the law, with caution and things like that. So there is a huge number of governmental and executive practices which raise distrust, inspire distrust, if you will. And I think talking about raising trust, it would be very important if in institutions this would be realized. If people who actually work in public administration, public services would understand this better. And I think one of the ways to address it would be to say, well, maybe when we are thinking about reforming democracy, we should think not less about government itself, about the practices of government, than about deliberation and decision-making practices that go on before and to some extent within institutions. So that would be my sort of sketch for an answer to that question. But okay, we have run out of time now, so let's take a lunch break. Lunch break means, because it's lunchtime in Iceland, it's 12 here. It's 2 o'clock in continental Europe. It's Zhar, is it 6 o'clock in Almaty?
Yeah.
And except for Larry Lessig, who was up very early, I guess the Americans might be joining us slowly from now on. It's 8 o'clock on the East Coast. So, so let's meet again at 12:45 GMT in 42 minutes or so, and then our speaker will be Silja Bára Ómarsdóttir, who is speaking from Iceland. And I just want to repeat that we will be, and I'm going to send an email to you, everyone who is participating as a speaker. We will be improvising the round table on the end, so I hope many people will be able to join us then. But that's it for now, and I'll see you again in almost 40 minutes time.